People wrote that it was because he came down a chimney, and so the ashes and the soot sort of covered his face and body. One of the things I find interesting about Belznickel is that he's one of the only characters of all these to actually arrive in the United States. Most of those other characters were described and acted out, and you still see them in Austria and Germany and some other countries. Belznickel was actually brought over by to the Pennsylvania Dutch in America, and so there are examples in the 19th and early 20th century of people in America dressing up as this Belznickel character and either bursting into people's houses playfully, or parents would describe this kind of Belznickel character to their children. But what's curious about these and all these other sorts of frightening characters is they don't exactly sound like Santa, right? First of all, is Santa actually punitive? He's supposed to be, right? He knows if you're naughty or nice, but he's not really going to beat you if you misbehave, right? There's this suggestion that Santa might punish you, but Santa is a little less terrifying than any of these other European characters. I found this cartoon online. And the joke, of course, of this cartoon is that's actually not what Santa would do at all, right? That's part of what makes it funny, is that's completely unlike Santa's personality. I could see Belznickel doing that, or Krampus doing that, but that's not Santa. Another thing about Santa is he actually Christian? When I tell this to my students, they're sort of immediately puzzled. But how would you know if Santa is Christian? Does Santa go to church? Does he believe that Jesus Christ is his Savior? Does he read the Bible? Right? Does Santa have an actual religion? If so, how could you tell? He doesn't dress like a bishop. He doesn't have a mitre. He doesn't have the robes. What about Santa is actually then specifically religious? Not about the holiday that is built around him, but about his own character, right? We know so much about his work and his life and where he lives in his region, but there's very little about religion in Santa Claus. There's a couple of attempts to kind of work Santa back into Christmas, right? The expression putting the Christ into Christmas has been popular in the last 10 years among conservative Protestants to kind of remind people or emphasize the religiousness of the holiday. And there are visuals of Santa Claus being at Jesus' birth or worshiping Jesus. There he is with baby Jesus. There he is in the manger scene. These always strike me as kind of odd, right? He's not wearing the right clothing. He's not seemingly in the right period. It's like he's clearly the odd man out of these stories, right? He's not quite worked in very well. And so how then do we get from this pre-medieval saint in the 4th century to this modern character of Santa Claus? All those other characters I talked about, like Chris Kindle and Belznickel, they deliver aspects of Santa Claus, but there's a lot still missing by the time we get to the 19th century. There's a lot we don't have. There's a lot that's not built up almost until the mid-19th century. And the people most responsible for creating the modern Santa Claus that we think of today is the poet. He was actually more famous as a reverend, but he wrote a famous poem I'll talk about in a second, Clement Moore, Thomas Nast, a 19th century illustrator. And then the covers of the Saturday Evening Post around the 19-teens and 1920s. I would argue that, and I've cut out a couple of people, but not many, but I think these three aspects of Santa Claus are the most important for identifying where I think the modern Santa Claus comes from. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of my presentation here. First, the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas by Clement Moore in 1823. When I was in class, I kind of passed this out to all my students, and we kind of read it together. And it's a lot of fun, right? Everybody knows 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. In fact, people know it so well that they often think that's the name of the poem. What's fascinating to me, though, if you read it carefully, is to take apart and identify from 1823, what are the aspects of Santa Claus that we would recognize today as what we think of as a modern Santa Claus, and what are the aspects of this poem that clearly reflect a pre-20th century notion of what Santa Claus is, right? There's aspects of Clement Moore's poem that make clear that the Santa Claus he has in his mind is not like the Santa Claus we have in our minds in the 21st century. I'll give you a couple of examples of each, right? So he has St. Nicholas going down the chimney. And this notion of Nicholas going down the chimney, people are not exactly clear where this connection comes from. That story that I talked about with St. Nicholas throwing the gold pieces in, there are versions in which he throws those gold pieces in the house through a window. Sometimes he drops them down a chimney. I mentioned that some of those dark characters like Belsnickel are supposed to have come down chimneys. It's not exactly clear where the notion of a chimney comes from. One of the things that's curious about chimneys in folklore is that they are often associated with mystical or magical. There's a lot of anxiety about mystical or magical creatures kind of coming out of chimneys or going through chimneys. But if anybody knows the Harry Potter stories, chimneys are a way that people travel, right, from one place to another. That notion comes from this folkloric idea that chimneys are somewhat a mystical place in which creatures can either emerge or disappear to. So it's not exactly clear how Clement sort of absorbs this idea of the chimney, but it existed before he wrote about it. Of course, he also changes the time, right? Although he's referring to the character as St. Nicholas isn't arriving on the eve of his feast day on the 6th. More instead moves it to the date that Christkindl arrives, right? Christkindl is the character who arrives on the 24th, the Protestant arrival of a magical being to deliver gifts for children. Clement Moore's poem is so popular and successful across the country that it sort of permanently lodges into the American psyche the connection between Christmas Eve and this character coming to visit, at least among many Americans. And he gets the description right. There's so many aspects of Santa Claus's physical appearance, right? The twinkling eyes, the rosy cheeks, the beard, the round belly, right, that shakes when he laughs, right? All that stuff is exactly how we picture Santa Claus today. But there's a couple aspects of this poem that seem not at all like how we imagine modern Santa Claus. For example, in several different times during the poem, Moore seems to imply that Santa is really, really small. He refers to him as a jolly old elf. And they're not regular, it's not a regular sleigh and regular reindeer, they're tiny reindeer and a miniature sleigh. Right? How big is this Santa Claus exactly? When people read the poem today, they sort of ignore the fact that Moore's idea of what Santa Claus looks like is probably a good deal smaller than the one that I started off with. And the clothing isn't quite right either. He's dressed in fur from head to foot. That seems right. But his clothing are tarnished with ashes and soot. It says he looked like a peddler just opening his pack. It doesn't quite sound like the kind of feasting, red, overflowing kind of Santa Claus we imagine. This Santa Claus looks like some of the 19th century characters I showed you earlier. And so when you read the poem, you get a sense of sort of how people in the 19th century imagine Santa Claus in a huge variety of ways. This is an 1884 newspaper illustration of Santa Claus. He's a dwarf, right? He's a miniature person in the story. This was an early 19th century chocolate mold of Santa. He's got this kind of elfin hat on. And there's the punch drawing that I showed you earlier, and perhaps the explanation for why people would associate Santa Claus as somewhat poor is because that's the Santa Claus people had in their imagination from Clement's poem. So there's some aspects of Santa Claus and his personality that Moore seems to nail down. And after Moore's poem becomes popular, those things become permanent, right? That look of Santa Claus and the reindeer. Moore is also the person who names the 8 reindeer, and those are sort of permanent after 1823. But there's other aspects we're not quite there yet, right? There's some things still missing. And some of those things are then added to by a political cartoonist, actually, named Thomas Nast, who was one of America's most popular cartoonists in the 19th century. He was the illustrator for Harper's Weekly up until 1886 when he died. And he established several aspects of Santa Claus's appearance that then also become sort of permanent after him. So this is one of his earliest drawings of Santa Claus. Seems to have it basic, a little rough around the edges, but seems to basically have the right idea. But it's Thomas Nast that establishes Santa's black boots and the black belt. It's after Nast's drawings of Santa Claus, and he's the first to put Santa Claus in a red outfit and sort of permanently make that Santa's outfit. After the late 19th century, nobody thinks about drawing Santa Claus in green like Father Christmas or in blue like that 19th century character I showed you. Nast permanently associates this color. Nast also invents the story of the North Pole residency and the helper elves that are associated with Santa Claus. Ironically, right, these elves, Santa's helpers, are in some ways connected to, I mean, St. Nicholas had helpers too. They were just kind of terrifying helpers. Whereas Santa's helpers in the North Pole are sort of delighted to be working in Santa's workshop. So it's Nast that delivers both aspects of the look of Santa Claus, but also a bit of the mythology of the character. Here's another drawing that Nast did, titled "I'll Never Do It Again." I zoomed in really close to you can't quite see it here, but I expanded this text and then hand wrote out what it is actually saying. It's a letter that Santa has. It says, "From Mom and Dad." And it's explaining, it's a letter from the parents explaining that their little boy hasn't been particularly good, and so he doesn't deserve to have rewards for Christmas. And so you can see, so in Nast's drawing, first notice he's got the mistletoe. That mistletoe comes from Father Christmas. Right? There's a lot of drawings of Santa Claus that sort of permanently have that aspect of Father Christmas's character. And he's got the big belly and the big sack. And he's clearly intending to criticize this boy, but compare that drawing of Santa Claus to that drawing of Krampus. Right? I get the impression that the kid on the right, he's still probably going to get some presents. He may not get exactly the presents he wants, but Santa's criticism in the Thomas Nast drawing is pretty mild, right, compared to the Germanic folklore that that has been kind of written out of Santa Claus's story. And this is perhaps Nast's most famous drawing in 1881. After 1881, this illustration of Santa Claus becomes sort of a template for artists hereafter. He gets almost everything right? You could immediately look at that and recognize almost every aspect of it belonging to Santa Claus, even the Father Christmas mistletoe on his head, like the old English folklore character had. But what Thomas Nast established is then sort of polished by the Saturday Evening Post, particularly two illustrators, J.C. Leyendecker and Norman Rockwell. And they, in the early 20th century, begin to work out, sort of between themselves, the look of Santa Claus that's so specific and clear that forever after they establish permanently what we think of as Santa Claus's look. Leyendecker begins drawing Santa Claus for the Post in 1918. Sometimes people are surprised by this. This is Santa Claus going off to war, right? People are sometimes surprised by this, although I found lots of illustrations from both World War I and World War II, of either illustrators or there's a couple illustrations I have of the US government working Santa into a kind of pro-war propaganda poster, right? That is, Santa becomes a really patriotic character in the 20th century, something that we didn't see before the 20th century. So Leyendecker begins to do these covers in the 19-teens. Here's another one, Santa behind a window. This one always freaks out my students. Santa looks alarmingly like, I don't know, he's kind of peeking in on people. My students don't like this one. But these Leyendecker illustrations proved really popular. And then starting in 1920, Norman Rockwell, for the same Saturday Evening Post, begins to produce some of his illustrations. This one's called Santa and Expense Book. Santa seems to be kind of thinking about children. This giant halo behind him. Notice he's still got the mistletoe in his hair. But he's working in this illustration. And then after Rockwell does this drawing, Leyendecker and Rockwell sort of begin to compete with each other for covers of the Saturday Evening Post. And so year after year, they produce these fantastic drawings. Here's another one by Norman Rockwell, Santa with elves. Santa seems like he's overcome or exhausted, and so the elves are kind of helping finish up the job. A Leyendecker one in 1923. This is one of my favorite drawings, right? He's still got the mistletoe. But every aspect of it reflects sort of Leyendecker's sensibility. Well, I'll come back to, actually, there's something I want to mention about it, but I want to put them both up so you can compare Leyendecker and Rockwell's. Here's another one from Leyendecker, 1925. And another one, Santa Up a Ladder, 1930. And then Norman Rockwell comes back in 1939, Santa at the Map. Seems like he's working out the route he's going to take, and he's got a book here, Extra Good Boys and Girls, right? So he's figuring out who to bring his gifts to based on this knowledge that he has of children's behavior. What I find interesting about the comparison between the Rockwell and Leyendecker characters is you get a sense of what these two illustrators sort of had in mind when they thought of Santa Claus. Rockwell very frequently portrayed Santa Claus as working. He was like this kind of a businessman, right? A merchant who was constantly working on his books or figuring out his plan or his map or exactly where he's going to go. Sometimes he's working so hard he's sort of exhausted. Leyendecker often drew Santa Claus as somewhat childlike, either in a kind of silly or ridiculous situation, like being chased by a family dog, or so tiny he's barely taller than this little child he's giving a hug to. And so these two artists in the 19-teens to the 1930s really nailed down what we think of as the modern Santa Claus figure. Sometimes people ask when I talk about sort of how this character developed about Coca-Cola, right? There's this kind of myth that Coca-Cola kind of invented the modern view of Santa Claus. And the Coca-Cola drawings were popular. In 1931, this illustrator, Hayden Sundblom, drew Santa Claus in ways that I think are very recognizable today. But in fact, if you look back at the Leyendecker drawings and the Rockwell drawings, Sundblom is already just simply reflecting what was already now standardized version of Santa Claus. Notice here, Santa Claus's book, right? It says good boys and girls. This is one of the things about Santa Claus's character that I find most interesting. Because as Santa Claus became more popular, merchants began to figure out that if they advertised Santa Claus or put Santa Claus in stores, it would be a way to attract lots of people. Pictures of Santa Claus sold magazines, having somebody dress up as Santa Claus. There were some advertisements I found in the 20th century where stores would just mention that Santa Claus dropped by. He wasn't actually there for people to see. He had just been there, right? And he left all these food and candies and treats that presumably you now had to go buy. And so when merchants began to sort of figure out that Santa Claus was a useful way to sell their products, that's when the last vestige of those 19th century and even medieval folkloric aspects of Santa Claus are gone. Notice in the Coca-Cola drawing, there's not even any bad children in the book. Right now, Santa Claus just has a book of good boys and girls. And so while ostensibly Santa is still judging people, the 1930s Santa to the present, the one that is really influenced by these various artists, writers, and advertisements that we've gone through, really sort of work out a lot and write out and draw out a lot of those kind of medieval and Germanic folkloric characteristics of Santa Claus, and then slowly begin to introduce and kind of polish off the rough edges of the St. Nicholas and Bell's Nickel and all the other aspects of Santa Claus that were a little more intimidating or frightening. And so I'm going to close my talk about the development